The problem with a warm introduction like that is it raises expectations beyond what's possible. So let me add my thanks to coming. I know it's the weekend. I know it's the beginning of the Easter holidays for some of you, so thank you. I am going to make the presentation tonight. My co-author, you'll see, well, you would have seen that on the book. The book was written by two people, myself and Sharon Toy, who is sitting here. All questions should be directed at Sharon, particularly if they're difficult. I have some good ones for you. So I'm going to describe the research that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years. It resulted in the book that the image was there. We launched the book at the World Economic Forum in Davos in mid-January. I'm going to take a risk with this audience and show you the actual research. It'll begin somewhat theoretical, and then it will get very, very practical indeed. So if you're thinking, this guy's talking to me about a lot of numbers, how does it all fit together? We are going to get to the very practical realities. All right, so, and I'll go rather quickly. You know, we can stop at the end and take Q&A. So first of all, we've called it accelerating performance. We're interested in organizational behavior in order to drive performance. I'll define what we mean by performance in a few slides. As we all know, being in business, it's a rather more nebulous concept than it might first appear. We started, actually, I always say 4 years ago, but I think it was about 5 years ago, with the question, and at that time, I was in McKinsey, running a bit of the business and working alongside Michael. And then I left McKinsey a couple of years ago and joined Heidrick and now run the consulting practice. So I began to be fascinated by this question: how come some organizations win and others lose? And to be honest, because I was in McKinsey at the time, I had a kind of strategic perspective, and I was interested in what's the nature of the competitive marketplaces that predict success or failure. And I went on a kind of journey to try and discover the answer to that. And I found it was kind of the wrong question, and I'm going to show you the results that we got. So it resulted in this book. You're not allowed to leave tonight without a copy of the book. If you've got children, please take it for them as well. Let me start with, we started with basic economics, and this is the busiest chart that I'll show you. They don't all look like this. So on the left-hand side, we actually looked at 122 different industry groupings. I think here I'm showing you 20 or 21 or so. And you can see, if you can see from the back, that we're showing you the 3-year adjusted EBITDA of these industries. And if you're in the software industry, it's a more profitable or a more attractive profit pool over the last few years than food and drug retailers, which is at the bottom. Indeed, the variation between the adjusted EBITDA over 3 years of the industry groupings on the left-hand side is 19 percentage points of margin. So whether you're aiming at attractive profit pools or less attractive profit pools, the margin that you can expect to generate varies by about 19%. You can do the same analysis by geography. It's around 21, 22%. The right-hand side measures a completely different thing. So the right-hand side is showing the variation between the top decile performers and the bottom decile performers within that industry. So just to use language in a loose way, if you think of the left-hand side as being strategy and the right-hand side as being execution. So the left-hand side is which profit pools do we want to attack? Where do we want to play? By industry or by geography? The right-hand side is saying once you've chosen your profit pools, whether they be the most attractive or medium or less attractive, do you win within that profit pool compared to your competitors? Left-hand side strategy, right-hand side execution. They both matter. They absolutely both matter. It would be crazy to throw away a significant variation in medium-term EBITDA by ignoring the strategy question. But the execution question matters even more. And when we began to look at that over time, we actually looked at it from the late 1800s onwards, but just showing it rather more recently. When you look at it over time, you find this is what happens. So the role of strategy in predicting performance, or the explanatory role of which profit pools are you aiming at, has declined markedly over the last 40 or 50 years. And the role of execution has gone up markedly. Now, if you think about, why has that happened, just think about two things. One is the cost of capital 40 years ago was about 18, 19%. Return on equity was generally running at around 22%. Cost of capital for most of your businesses today and there's several bankers in the room, so we could bring the cost of capital even further down, but it's generally running at somewhere between 7 and 12% or so. So the role of capital in explaining long-term business success has relatively declined, and the role of execution has gone up. The other way of thinking about the same thing is, 40 years ago, capital was a local issue. Now with the massive wave of deregulation, privatization, the globalization of private equity markets, capital is much more fluid around the world. That means that the access to capital is less likely to be a determinant of your long-term success. So that kind of took me by surprise. Strategy still absolutely matters. I'm not in any way suggesting that you should adopt a dumb strategy, but execution matters more. So that then led us to the obvious question, which is how come some companies are better at execution than other companies? There's been an awful lot of research over the last 30 years on how come some companies are better at strategy than others, but actually remarkably little on what makes a company good at execution. So that's the journey that we went on. In order to answer that question, we went on quite a few wrong terms, I'd have to say, but we started with the question, which metric of all the hundreds of metrics that you measure, which metric is the best predictor of a subsequent or future rise in the value of the enterprise? We looked at 19 of them, but I'm only going to show you 5 here. And all of these make a difference. So actually, statistically, a prior rise in value is a predictor of a subsequent rise in value, but a weak one. And I wouldn't bet on the stock market on that basis, but it is a weak predictor. A rise in EBITDA today predicts a rise in the value of the company tomorrow. A reduction in cost is actually a stronger predictor because the capital markets interpret a reduction in cost as being more sustainable than a rise in EBITDA. Not always true, but that's generally true. A share buyback will certainly move your enterprise valuation up, but we looked at over 800 of them, and the half-life of a share buyback in terms of impact on the share price is just less than 10 months. So it's a relatively short-term thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. But by far and away, the best or the most predictive metric, which if you drive it up today, will drive up the value of your company tomorrow, is an increase in organic growth. Now, all organic growth is selling more things or doing it at a higher price, or both. So your grandmother could have told you that, right? If you sell more stuff, your company is going to be more valuable. So we take a rise in revenue, an organic rise in revenue, as the primary metric. And almost everything I say from now on is using that metric as the main way of thinking about this. So what we then did is we took the 500 biggest listed companies in the world. So the FT 500, people sometimes get confused. This is not the 500 biggest companies in the UK. It's just the 500 biggest in the world. It's like the Fortune 1000, but that is just US companies. So the 500 biggest listed entities. And we segmented them into 5 quintiles of revenue growth. We're interested in what do these companies do to drive that revenue growth. After about a year's worth of work, it turned out we were wrong to do that. It didn't actually answer any question. And the reason was, if you do that, you compare an airline with a pharma company with a bank. That doesn't really take you anywhere. So we went back to the 500 companies, and we put them into peer groups. So airlines with airlines, banks with banks, etc. In order to do that, we had to look at the underlying growth dynamics of each industry. And perhaps surprisingly, investment banking over the last 7 years has been the fastest growing industry. Bankers in the room will remember that there was an event 9 years ago that led to a fall. So it's not surprising that it's gone up in the last 7 years. Metals and mining have had a torrid time recently. So you look at the underlying growth rate of each of the industries, and you begin to be able to put companies into peer groups. So there's a kind of set of almost ecosystems in which it's appropriate to compare one company with another company. We did that for a while, did lots of analysis around it, and we then took all of those 500 companies and we allocated them based on organic revenue growth into 5 categories. So if your company is growing more than 8% a year organically, we call that an accelerating company. If your company is shrinking by more than 8% a year, that's a derailing company with everything in the middle. And obviously what we were interested in is how do you go further north up that scale? How do you get more of that organic growth? So in doing that, we wanted to make sure that we were kind of knocking out any kind of cheating processes or any mechanisms to be on that list that weren't really based on competitive success. And we applied what we call the 4 rules of 20. So the first rule of 20 is to kind of appear on our list. You have to be in the top quintile, top 20%, for organic revenue growth over both 3 years and 7 years. So we didn't want companies who are good in the short term but didn't make it over the long term or vice versa. And in doing that, that knocked out a whole bunch of the 500. Second rule of 20 was any fool can grow if you do it inorganically, if you use your shareholders' money to get growth. So we're only really interested in companies that manage to achieve most of their growth, 80% of their growth, organically. Anyone that acquired their way to growth, we knocked out. Third is that we wanted to avoid companies that were overly dependent on funding from their home state. So there'll be quite a few companies here tonight, represented here tonight, that get a lot of revenue from their home state, although by no means all of you. And we just needed to be careful that we were really observing companies that were in a genuinely competitive marketplace. And then finally, as I'm sure we all know, generally, company profit margins decline as you grow. So little entrepreneurial companies may well be making 50% gross margin. It's hard to do that if your company's worth 100 billion. However, we wanted to knock out any companies who they were growing, but their profitability was falling off a cliff. So any company where their relative profit margin declined by more than 20% was off our list. So take the 500 biggest companies in the world, apply those rules. We thought there'd be a reasonable amount of companies left over, maybe 100 or so. Turned out that there were only 23 companies. We did this work about a year ago. We just reran the analysis last week, actually. And as of today, there are 22 companies. But let me just use the number of 23. 23 companies that were pulling away from the pack. And we call them the super accelerators. Let me show you the names of these 23. They're arranged here by total revenue, so the size, essentially. And there's a few interesting things about this list. First of all, you see, if I'd asked you to brainstorm who are the most successful companies in the world, I'm sure you would have brainstormed Apple, kind of annoyingly. They are top of our list. I kind of wish they were. Nothing against Apple, but it's somewhat predictable they're there. Google, we've got a colleague here from Google. Holding company is Alphabet, the third one on the list. So there are the West Coast tech darlings appear on the list. There's also, for me at least, some surprising companies. So Danaher, in a way, is a good old-fashioned industrial conglomerate. I know some of you compete with Danaher. They just do it extraordinarily well. We've got quite a few financial services chief execs in the room, and you can see MasterCard and HDFC on their intercontinental exchanges, a trading exchange like NASDAQ. So quite a few financial services companies. As you can tell from my accent, I'm European, British, Scottish even. There is only one European company on there. I'm glad to say they're British. Unfortunately, they're not Scottish. My nationality varies depending on whether Andy Murray has won the Wimbledon or not. But for today, let me just call myself British. So only one European company. Out of the 23 most successful growth engines in the world, only one of them is European. You will have spotted none of them are from this region, or none of them are from the immediate region. Asia is no longer developing. Asia is well and truly developed, if this list is anything to go by. We've got a very significant membership of the list from Asia. So we were very interested in, is this luck or how have they done it? And clearly, if you're in the top group for both 3 years and 7 years, it's not just going to be luck. You're going to have some capabilities or ways of doing things that explain your extraordinary growth. The aggregated organic growth of these companies over the last 3 years has been 14%. The aggregate growth of the remaining FT 500 is 4.2%. So these companies are growing by more than 3 times the average growth rate of successful companies. So we're interested in how. You know, what did they do that enabled growth? So we went back to our the FT500. We asked for permission to study them all. We were really privileged to be given permission to study. So it's half of them. It's not quite half. It's 239 of them. And we studied those companies for 3.5 years, almost 4 years. And they allowed us to get under the skin, get lots of data, be a little bit intrusive, and understand what kind of their secret sauce was. Now remember, we're studying here not just the 23, we were able to study all of the 23, but we studied 239 of the 500. So we saw all of the very best, some very good ones, some average ones, and some below average ones. And we're interested in teasing out the differences. It's an unusual slide. So we started with 180 hypotheses. So in addition to my work at Heidrick, I spend about a day a week at Oxford, where I'm Professor of Organisation Behaviour. And I like to bring a kind of academic rigour to this as well. So we had 180 hypotheses. A hypothesis is something like companies with greater gender diversity outperform companies with less gender diversity. That one turned out to be true. The empirical evidence told us that that was true. Another hypothesis would be companies with small head offices outperform companies with big head offices. That one turned out, annoyingly to me, not to be true. I still say it because I believe in it, but the data does not support it in any way. So in using the data to confront the hypotheses, we were trying to get at the truth of the matter. So first, we found that some of the hypotheses were just simply wrong. I dreamed them up, other colleagues had dreamed them up. They were nice, but they were wrong. There was no empirical evidence for it. Second group was they were true, but they were correlated, not causal. Actually, the head office one is an example of that. Companies with smaller head offices do, on average, outperform companies with bigger head offices. But there's no empirical evidence at all that when you reduce the size of your head office, you increase your performance. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. The third is that there were some of the hypotheses that were true, they were causal, but they were only relevant to some of those companies, in particular financial services companies, where some of the dynamics around performance are a little different. And then finally, there were some that were true and they were causal, but they were only relevant in some circumstances, in particular turnaround. That left us with, I have to say, the deeply inconvenient number of 13. And I tried every statistical trick in the book to make it 10 or the magical 7. But there are 13 things that we found drove the difference between less good companies and better companies. I'll show you them in detail on the page after this, but I just wanted to show you just the kind of data, just briefly. So the 13 things around the outside, I'll come to them in a second. And then the lines here, or the colours, represent the different levels of growth. So if you're the red line is companies that are shrinking by more than 8% a year. The green line is companies that are growing by more than 8% a year with everything in between. And what you can see is a rather striking picture, which is the less good, and I never like to call them winning companies and losing companies, it's a bit insulting, but the bottom quintile companies do these 13 things, they just don't do them anywhere near as well as the top quintile companies who do them terrifically well. The data is what the academics call parametric, the lines don't overlap, heavily suggesting that the better you are at these things, the more likely you are to be able to drive organic growth. So what are these things? Most of them, I think, are pretty self-evident, but let me just take you through them. We call them drag and drive factors. So when you get them wrong, they're called drag factors. They kind of hold you back. When you get them right, they're drive factors. No one can remember 13 things. I certainly can't remember 13 things. So we put them into 4 categories. META, meta. Mobilize, execute, transform with agility. So, and these are, this is an organization on a bad day. These are the drag factors. So I won't talk you through all 13. I hope they're fairly clear. So internal focus is more of the energy of the organization is consumed with feeding the beast internally than focusing on your external stakeholders, particularly your customers. Confusion is we don't know where we're going as a business. Everyone's got a different opinion. There's no alignment. Unclear accountability and complexity are the two that are statistically most associated with failure. As organizations grow, they tend to get more complex. There's a layering effect over time, and in the end, no one can get anything done. A lack of accountability, of being able to hold people to account, predicts failure. Maybe the only one that I'll point out is the one on the right-hand side called immunity. You will have all seen this, a business or a team where they're very clear that we're here and we want to go to here, but they get in their own way in terms of moving from here to here. And we call that immunity. We work a lot with a very talented professor at Harvard called Bob Keegan, who wrote Immunity to Change, and we're building on his work there. So that's what it looks like on a bad day. If your business looks like that all the time, you should probably leave here and go and do something about it. Turning from that to the drive factors. So organization, the inverse of that. Now, I'd have to say, of all the companies we measured, we did not find a single company that was outstanding, in other words, in the top quintile, for every one of these in all time periods. So it's not realistic to think your company can be an exemplar on every one of these. But we did not find any of the super accelerators that were not in the top 2 quintiles for all of these every time we measured it. So what does it look like? Some of again, I hope fairly intuitive. Customer first. I said it was inconvenient that there are 13. One of the convenient bits of the data is that customer first is statistically the most important one of these. It really is first. Your ability to create an enterprise which is fully focused on your customers' needs. Energizing leadership. Someone just gave me a great phrase last week of what we mean by energizing leaders. So an energizing leader is someone who lights up the room on their way in rather than on their way out, which I thought was a nice way of thinking about some leaders that I've met. Clarity about where we're going, simplicity, ownership, strong capabilities, high level of challenge, high level of learning and adaptability. So these 13 characteristics, I'd invite you to just think about them and think, I would hope you would be able to say, my business is actually pretty good at 5 or 6 of these. There's a few of them that, although they're important, they're a bit less critical for us, but there's a couple of them where we're off the pace. And if we could do something about those 2 or 3 or whatever, then we could really drive value. We have an easy and robust way of measuring these 13 things. They're not the most difficult things in the world to measure. The art is not in measuring them, it's in doing something about them. Which indeed took us to the next bit of the research. Okay, how do the best companies in the world actually do something about these 13? How do they, is it just hope that you get good at these things, or are there actual interventions that you can make? So we kind of started again. This was about 2 years ago. We went back to all the super accelerators, and we, in effect, looked at the difference between the behavior or the actions of the top quintile from the bottom quintile. And we called them differentiating actions because they make the difference. Now, there are 13 of those, and we were trying to capture the 3 actions that you might want to take in each of the 13, which means there are 39 actions. You will be relieved to know I'm not going to talk you through 39 things. I'll just give you a quick feel for a few of them, and you can scan the rest of them. So we've categorized those 39 into META. So starting off with mobilize, these are the 9 things we found that the super accelerators do to achieve very high scores in terms of mobilize. As I say, I won't go through all of them, but I'll just pick 2 of them. So use purpose as your fuel, the one on the right-hand side. There's a lot of literature at the moment, a lot of interest in the topic of purpose. I kind of thought when we did the hard empirical analysis, we would find it was a little bit fabricated. We didn't find that at all. We found organizations that had embedded a deep sense of purpose do outperform organizations that don't. The variation between the top and the bottom quintile is a factor of about 3x in terms of sense of purpose. So I'd invite you to think about, I assume that you put a lot of energy into communicating with your colleagues, motivating your employees. Are you appropriately emphasizing the important purpose of the work that they do? To flip to a very different kind of philosophical stance, think of business units as guests, not family. What we mean by that is at the end of your weekend, you can throw your guests out. You can't necessarily throw your family out. So we looked at organizations that acquire a lot and organizations that divest a lot. And we found what many other researchers have found, which is there's nothing wrong with acquisition. Well, There's not always something wrong with acquisitions, although many acquisitions destroy value from the acquirer. But organizations that are active in managing their portfolio and divesting tend to outperform organizations that don't. So when you think about your portfolio, your businesses, your countries, your product markets, your channels, you'll have a whole bunch of stuff. Do you need all that stuff? Are there parts of that you could be more active in divesting of? So let's move from mobilize, and hopefully you've scanned the rest of them, to execute. So I'll just pick reduce layers. So here I'm thinking about organizational layers in the hierarchy. If you take the chief executive and you take the frontline non-managerial staff and you look at the number of layers in between, the super accelerators have on average 4, just over 4, 4.1 something. The bottom quintile organizations have on average 7. How many layers do you have? Do you have 1 or 2 too many? Second one I picked, which kind of goes with it, is the one at the bottom in the middle, big people in big jobs. People often say to me, all this stuff you're talking about, Colin, it must take a lot of great managers to do it. Well, kind of. It takes great managers to do it. But the top quintile organizations have 20% less managers as a ratio to non-managerial staff. The best organizations have less managers, not more managers. And because they've got bigger people in bigger jobs, they've got lower complexity, they've got faster speed to market, speed to value. We go from execute to transform. So by transform, I mean, is your business adapting and changing at least the pace of the market changing? And I'll pick, emphasize speed to adoption. So I've got a favorite example here. So by speed to adoption, we were interested in when someone in your business comes up with a good idea, how long does it take for that idea to be fully implemented across the relevant bit of the business? And we actually measured how long did it take to get to half of the appropriate market share. The slowest organization that we've yet measured is the English National Health Service, which if you live in England is a problem. So the actual example we measured is called the venous thromboembolism. So if you have a stroke, best clinical practice to stop you dying after a stroke is called a venous thromboembolism. It's a way of protecting the arteries. There is no debate that it's the right thing to do. It was invented about 15 years ago in Newcastle in the northeast of England. It has not yet reached half of the hospitals in England. In that period, there's been 4,700 preventable deaths that this process would have stopped. So you've got an institution there, which is many different institutions linked together, where the not invented here syndrome is literally causing people to die. The best example we found was Cisco, where in their sales force, which is run by a very strong leader, a guy called Chris Dedicoat globally, the average time it takes for an idea from one part of the sales function to be applied to half the market share within the sales function is not 9 years, it's 4 days. So there are the two extremes that we found. Your company will be somewhere in the middle. How long does it take for you to spread good ideas? Let me go from transform to the final one, agility. What do we mean by agility? The Americans would call it pivoting. We mean the ability of the organization to quickly change direction. I don't mean, completely stop everything you're doing and start a different thing. But if you spot a market opportunity, how long does it take to gear up to address that opportunity? That's what we mean by agility. So there's a whole bunch here, but I'm just going to talk about develop digital dexterity, and we were just chatting over our dinner about this. So if you think of digital as being a kind of pyramid, where at the bottom you've got automation, at the middle you've got robotics, and at the top you've got AI, artificial intelligence. We've all been automating our businesses for 20, 30 years. SAP is automation, Oracle is automation, a spreadsheet is automation. Robotics, 5 years ago, was futuristic. It really is here today. It's been here in the manufacturing world for perhaps 10 or 15 years, but in the services world, we're learning that robotics often produces not only lower cost, but higher quality outcomes. And then when you get up to AI, I'd have to say my own work around this topic would say AI is today where robotics was 5 years ago. It holds tremendous promise. I don't think anyone quite knows how to do it yet. There hasn't been a systematic large-scale application of it. But if you think of insurance and risk underwriting, or you think of credit scoring in retail banking, or any of the kind of intellect-heavy tasks of organizations, AI holds the promise of vastly reducing human error. The problem with the human decision-making process, our brains, is what's called the self-affirmation bias. By the time we've made a decision, we believe we're right. And actually, sadly, we're wrong a great deal of the time. And AI has the opportunity to shift that. Now, if you take all three of those together, automation, robotics, AI, we found a lot of evidence, and my own opinion would be, if you're not fully embracing the digital revolution, you are slowly walking into a nightmare. I'm not saying you should be on the bleeding edge of it. I'm not saying you spend 1 year's revenue in chasing AI. But if you're not fully into the digital world, the evidence is you're going to have a very significant problem. So those are the 39. We're not saying it's a menu, eat everything on the menu, do all 39, and there's nothing available off menu. Of course, there are many companies that we didn't study that will have their own fantastic interventions. But what we did find is that those 13 drive factors don't just appear by accident. The super accelerators do these things, or a selection of these things. So the next question was, well, which selection? How do you decide which ones to do? Do you just look at the chart and think, well, I like the sound of that, let me choose that? And of course you don't. What we found, naturally enough, we looked at all of the data for the 239 companies, and we found 4 patterns. We call them recipes, you could call them archetypes, but 4 different ways of being successful that draw on different approaches to organization effectiveness. And we call them customer intimate, talent magnet, execution engine, and portfolio investor. So customer intimate companies are ones that seek to understand the customer better than they understand themselves. Their competitive DNA is they're embedded in the supply chain of their customers. They know everything about their customers. Cigna, large US-based health insurer, wonderful example of that. Talent magnet, someone like a Google or actually a McKinsey in the consulting world, or a Goldman Sachs in the investment banking world. Of course they care about their customers, but that's not their competitive DNA. Their competitive DNA is they just get the best talent, and they apply it to customers, but it's a talent play. Execution engine, I think of Tata as a great example here. 320,000 people, huge, all over the world. Of course they care about their customers, of course they care about their talent, but that's not how they win. They win by winning the game of inches, being a little bit better every day. And portfolio investor is companies that are able to apply assets, which are cash, capital, and talent, to opportunities, which are products, customers, and markets. If you can do that effectively at low transaction cost, that's a highly effective organization. So if you're familiar with Michael Porter's work on strategy, what Michael says essentially is don't get stuck in the middle. Choose between his different forms of strategy. In a way, we found the same thing. Failure mode in organizations is when your HR director is telling you we need to be a talent organization. Your marketing director is saying we need to be a customer organization. Your ops director is execution, and you end up being nothing. What we found is choose. I'm not literally saying you can only do one of those and who cares about the rest. But it's the role of the chief executive, the top team, and the board to be very clear of the kind of organization you're trying to create when you grow up. Now, based on that choice, you then apply different mixtures of the 39 actions. And I think on the outside edge, they're kind of intuitive. If you want to be a talent magnet, probably best if you invest in people, probably best if you've got great teams. But let me just take a second on the inside. So these were 5 of the 39 that we found that had a striking statistical element to them. So we found all of the, well, to be accurate, 22 of the 23 super accelerators rate in the top quintile for these 5 things. We found no company in the top quintile organizations that were not also in the top 2 quintiles on these 5 things. So it appears to us that these 5, what we call threshold actions, are the things you just have to get right. They're kind of non-negotiable. So quickly through them. We've talked about using purpose. People at your level role modeling urgency. If you want your organization to move at pace and accelerate, if you don't role model that, you're going to be challenged. We've already talked about reducing layers. We haven't really talked about exiting people who don't live your values. And we've talked about developing digital dexterity. They're kind of table stakes. Not that they're unimportant, but if you don't get those 5 things right, the rest probably don't matter. So we're getting towards the end of our kind of research journey. Let me just give you a more intuitive feel for these 4 recipes. So David from Cigna, a wonderful guy, talks about their business in this way, which is it's just all about the customer. I've heard dozens, if not hundreds, of chief executives say that, but their business is really designed in that way. If that was the right recipe for you, is your business designed in that way? Moving from customer intimate to portfolio investor, Danaher, that I've already mentioned, incredibly impressive organization, very much into the fluid allocation of resources. Moving from portfolio investor to execution engine, HDFC is a global bank now, but an Indian bank by origin. I know we've got a few bankers in the room. One of the things that they've done that really impressed me, I actually tried it myself, is what they call the 10-second loan. So you obviously pre-populate your application online. It's not literally 10 seconds just talking to someone. And then you call up and you apply for your loan. And based on the information, very good algorithms and data mining, their average time to yes is 3.2 seconds. It's longer to no, but the average time to yes on the phone is 3.2 seconds. That is a good example of an execution focus. And then finally, my old colleague from McKinsey, Matt Britton from Google, talks about the way that Google think about organization, in a way, somewhat chaotic, which is kind of ignore the organization structure and the processes. Alice can talk about that until the cows come home. I'm not saying all business, if you're running a steel mill, don't do it like Google do it. You'll be bust very quickly. But to think in a more creative way about how to use the organization behavior. All right, so those are the 4 recipes. So I hope you're thinking, which one is right for us. Just to hammer home the point, what we found, well, let me skip to this. We only found 6 companies of the 239 who were good at 2 recipes, top quintile for 2 recipes. Now, all 6 of those happen to be in the group of 23 super accelerators. So it seems to be the case that unless you are in the elite group of super accelerators, don't try and do 2. Choose 1 and be distinctively good at it. So which one is right for you? Now, all of that still left us with one remaining question. So let me just go back. We were trying to answer 4 questions. One is, why do some companies win? And the answer is they're better at execution. No excuse for having a bad strategy, but they're better at execution. Second question is, how are they better at execution? Well, they do more of the drive factors and less of the drag factors. Third question is, well, how do you get those drive factors to be good? Well, you do some of the 39, and you choose which ones to do based on the recipe. We still had a remaining question, which was, well, how come some leaders are good at doing that and others aren't? So we looked at just over 1,800 leaders across the 239 companies. We were given the opportunity to kind of assess and evaluate them, and we looked at what were the differentiating skills. I'm slightly cheating to call it skills because they're really clusters of capabilities. And we found 4 things. And maybe think about your own top 100 people. How good are they at these 4 things? First one we call ripple intelligence. So you could call it strategic thinking. It's kind of the ability to see around corners, join the dots, be on the balcony and the dance floor at the same time, kind of run the race and get your head up at the same time. The highest growth companies simply had more leaders who are able to be kind of ambidextrous, very much driving performance today and able to think about tomorrow. Second one we call resource fluidity. So these are leaders who are able to allocate the company's precious resources based on the prospects, in other words, the value you can create, rather than the politics of the organization. We call it resource fluidity. And if you just think for a moment, what is an organization? I've spent years and years thinking about this very basic question. You know, if a single person could build a Boeing Dreamliner, and a Boeing Dreamliner sold for 400 million, that's what we would all do. We would build a Boeing Dreamliner each, but you need thousands of people to build a Boeing Dreamliner, so we create an organization. An organization is a matching process for the application of cash, capital, and talent to opportunities. If you do it well, you have high resource fluidity. If I just give you the inverse example, I was with the top team of a very large bank in the US 2 weeks ago. And you know, the challenge with banking at the moment, like many of the industries represented here, is we used to have return on equity of about 20% with cost of capital about 10%. Now we've got return on equity of about 11% with cost of capital damn close to 11%. So it's a tough market to be in. So you need to use the resources you've got as wisely as possible. So I'm sitting with this top team. We've got the head of investment banking, head of wealth management, head of retail, etc. And it's clear that what we should be doing is moving resources in their particular case from investment banking to wealth management. The long-term returns, in particular the multiple associated with wealth management, for that particular business, much better than for investment banking. What happens? Well, the guy that runs investment banking wants to keep all of the resources within investment banking. Of course he does. So do we move resources? No, not really. We just marginally change the investment budget on a year-to-year basis, but we don't go back to basics. Resource fluidity is about radically shifting resources. Third one, dissolving paradox. So you're all senior people. You know that as you become more senior, the answer to most questions becomes yes. Right? So your people come to you and they say, Mr. or Ms. Chief Executive, do you want to run a low-cost operation or a very customer-intimate operation? And your answer is yes, I do. I want to do both of those, right? Do you want your people to be highly empowered and passionate and engaged? Or because you operate in a regulated environment, you want them to be very disciplined and controlled? Yes, I do. I want both of those things. If you think about them as alternatives, you're going to lose the competitive race. If you think about them in a binary way, the end is near. The best organizations are able to reframe that and think about them in a more integrated way. And then finally, the last one, liquid leadership, goes back to this point I made earlier about lighting up the room on the way in. I'll explain this one just through a number, because I like numbers. So these 1,800 people, we asked the people that worked for them a series of questions. One of the questions was, do you aspire to be like your boss? Simplest question you could ever ask. We asked it on a 0 to 7 scale. In the top quintile organizations, the average answer was 6.1. You know, most people want to be like their boss. In the bottom quintile organizations, the organizations that are shrinking by more than 8% a year, the average answer went down from 6.1 to 0.9. They simply have leaders that the followers do not want to follow. It's as simple as that. So in your organization, have you got any of those? Now, you might have to put up with a few. They might know where the bodies are buried. But if you've got too many of them, you're going to drive your organic growth down. So those are the 4. They're all difficult. I've never observed an organization in which I could truthfully say, you know, they're populated with superhumans that are brilliant at all of these. But those are the 4 skills or capabilities that differentiate the winners from the losers. How good is your organization? All right, let me just finish, if I may, with a quick, almost numerical analysis of the payoff. So we were interested in, you know, if you do all this stuff, does it make a difference financially? And we wanted to analyze it at the level of the individual, the team, and the organization. So at the individual level, these 1,800 people, we looked at the economic performance of the best leaders and the worst leaders, top quintile, bottom quintile. And the answer is about 4. The best leaders produce 4 times more money than the worst leaders. We then looked at about 3,200 teams in those organizations. how much more, when you think about the teams in your business, say you've got 50 teams that matter, and you put them into 5 quintiles of 10, and you compare the productivity of the top teams from the bottom teams, the difference on average is about 23%. And then finally, the one that's most intuitively obvious and probably matters the most to us is share price performance. So we did the most simple analysis, which is if you take $100, 100 US, and you invest it in the 23 super accelerators 7 years ago, how much would it be worth today? And the answer is 436. So you've gone from 100 to 436, you've added $336 of value. If you'd invested the same $100 in the other companies within the 500, excluding the 23, you'd have still made money, but your $100 would be worth just over 200 today. So the delta in the first one is 300, delta in the second one is roughly 100. So it's 3 times more value by being a high growth company than being a low growth company. Very final thing I'll say. I've come at this discussion tonight partly because of the audience through the numbers and through finances, because ultimately that's what business is about. But in order to do everything I've talked about, or anything I've talked about, ultimately it's about human behavior, right? So every business is a talent business, and it's all about, can you shift the behavior of individuals, teams, and the organization as a whole? And you don't need me to tell you, but I'm going to tell you anyway, that the most influential person in an organization that can shift behavior is the chief executive and the top team and the chairperson and the board. But it's the senior leadership community in the organization that shape it. So if you've listened to me tonight and you think, you know, my organization's pretty good at this and not too good at that, also have a little thought about what's your own role in that. The dysfunctionality in any organization somewhat comes from the top of the organization. And indeed, the great things about organizations somewhat come from the top. So I'd invite you to not only think about what the organization needs to do differently, but also maybe what you need to do differently. On that moment, I appreciate I stand between you and dessert. Let me stop there. We'd love to take questions, comments, disagreements, agreements, and we'll open it up. But just to give you a break from listening, why don't we just stop for 5 minutes? We'll clear your plates, we'll get pudding out. I say pudding because I'm English. And then we'll open it up to discussion. But thank you for listening so far, and we'll open it up again. Thank you.